The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive of January to March 1944 was one of the decisive Soviet operations of the Second World War, ending the nearly 900-day siege of Leningrad and forcing German Army Group North into a retreat it would never reverse. Its origins lay in 2.5 years of brutal attritional warfare, where the survival of Leningrad had become both a strategic and symbolic question for the Soviet Union, while for Germany, the city represented a fixed objective in Hitler's plans for domination of the Soviet Northwest. By late 1943, the conditions that had long defined the front around Leningrad had begun to shift. Since September 1941, the city had been encircled from the south and east, cut off from land communication except across Lake Ladoga through the so-called German forces, primarily the 18th Army of Army Group North, had entrenched themselves in fortified positions running from the Gulf of Finland through Emga, Tosno, and southward toward Novgorod. These positions were intended to keep Leningrad neutralized indefinitely while freeing German forces for operations elsewhere. The Red Army, however, had gradually improved its situation. After the counteroffensive of January 1943, which broke the inner blockade along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, the Soviets had re-established a tenuous land corridor into the city. Rail communications were restored later that year, easing the worst of the starvation, though Leningrad remained under artillery bombardment. At the same time, Soviet armies on the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts were reorganized, refitted, and reinforced for major offensive action. By the end of 1943, Stavka directed its attention to decisively lifting the siege and clearing German forces from the entire region between Leningrad and Novgorod. The German side faced growing difficulties. Army Group North was commanded by Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, who had orders from Hitler to hold its positions to the last man. This directive left little room for operational flexibility. By January 1944, the 18th Army and the 16th Army held a long front with roughly 741,000 men, 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and around 10,600 artillery pieces and mortars. The Soviets, by contrast, concentrated approximately 1.25 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 20,000 artillery pieces in the region, distributed across the Leningrad front under Leonid Govorov, the Volkhov front under Kirill Meretskov, and the Second Baltic Front under Andrei Eremenko. Political pressure was also a decisive factor. Stalin demanded that 1944 begin with a breakthrough in the Northwest, both to relieve Leningrad and to demonstrate Soviet strength to its Western allies. With Allied planning for an invasion of France underway, a major Soviet success would reinforce the perception of the USSR's growing dominance on the Eastern Front. Furthermore, the Red Army was preparing for the liberation of the Baltic states, and breaking German positions around Leningrad was the necessary first step. For the population of Leningrad, the impending offensive represented the possibility of relief after years of deprivation. Soviet propaganda emphasized the imminent destruction of the fascist ring around the city, portraying the offensive as both a military and moral reckoning. German soldiers, however, faced the battle with resignation rather than zeal. Reports from the front describe shortages of ammunition and winter clothing, overstretched divisions, and declining morale after 2 years of static warfare with little prospect of decisive victory. Thus, on the eve of January 1944, the stage was set for a massive Soviet operation. The Red Army would attack simultaneously from multiple directions. The Leningrad front would strike south toward Krasnoye Selo and Rapsha to sever the German front. The Volkhov front would push west from Novgorod, and the Second Baltic Front would apply pressure to prevent German reinforcements. The objective was not only to drive the enemy back from Leningrad, but to annihilate large parts of Army Group North and regain control of the entire Leningrad Oblast. The stakes were clear. For the Soviets, the offensive promised the liberation of Leningrad and the opening of the road to the Baltic. For the Germans, defeat meant the collapse of their northern front. Both sides committed their available resources, aware that the fighting to come would determine the fate of a city that had already become one of the defining symbols of the war. The Soviet offensive to finally break the siege of Leningrad began on 14th of January 1944. The Leningrad front, commanded by General Leonid Govorov, opened its assault with a concentrated artillery barrage involving more than 100,000 shells fired over a period of 2 hours. The bombardment targeted the German 18th Army's fortified positions around Krasnoye Selo and Ropsha, south of the city. These defenses had been in place for over 2 years, consisting of trenches, bunkers, minefields, and interlocking strongpoints supported by heavy artillery. The opening firestorm aimed to suppress German guns and shatter their forward defenses, creating conditions for Soviet infantry and armor to advance. Immediately following the artillery preparation, infantry from the 42nd Army attacked across frozen ground toward Krasnoye Selo, supported by the 2nd Shock Army moving against Ropsha. Soviet forces deployed new tactics refined through earlier offensives in 1943, emphasizing concentrated firepower and close coordination between artillery, tanks, and infantry. Assault groups equipped with submachine guns, flamethrowers, and explosives targeted bunkers and pillboxes, while engineers cleared minefields under fire. Despite stiff resistance, by the end of the first day, the Soviets had penetrated up to 6 kilometers into German lines, seizing several fortified villages and breaching the outer ring of defenses. The German 18th Army, commanded by General Georg Lindemann, reacted by throwing in local reserves, including elements of the 9th and 10th Luftwaffe Field Divisions and the 61st Infantry Division. These units, already weakened by previous attrition and poor supply, struggled to contain the Soviet advance. Communications between command posts broke down under the weight of artillery fire, and counterattacks were piecemeal, often conducted by understrength battalions without adequate armored support. Field Marshal von Küchler reported the situation as critical to the Wehrmacht High Command, but Hitler's orders forbade withdrawal and demanded that every position be held. Meanwhile, the Volkhov Front under General Kirill Meretskov launched its offensive 2 days later, on 16th January, against German positions around Novgorod. The assault began with a massive artillery preparation similar to that at Leningrad, followed by infantry attacks supported by tanks moving over ice-covered terrain. The Germans defending Novgorod, primarily the 28th Jaeger Division and the 21st Infantry Division, faced encirclement as Soviet units crossed the frozen Volkhov River. The ferocity of the Soviet assault forced the Germans to abandon Novgorod after bitter fighting, retreating westward under constant pressure. The fall of Novgorod marked one of the most significant early successes of the operation, as it severed key German defensive lines and opened the way toward Luga. As the Soviet offensives gained momentum, coordination between fronts became critical. Govorov's Leningrad Front and Meretskov's Volkhov Front aimed to link their advances to trap German forces in a broad pocket, stretching from Krasnoye Selo to Novgorod. Simultaneously, the Second Baltic Front under General Andrei Eremenko increased pressure further south, tying down German reserves and preventing them from reinforcing the endangered 18th Army. This three-pronged strategy created mounting pressure that German command could not adequately respond to. The impact on the civilian population of Leningrad was immediate. Although the city remained under artillery fire during the early days of the offensive, the knowledge that Soviet troops were finally pushing the Germans back brought a surge of morale. For the first time in nearly 900 days, Leningraders began to sense that the siege might soon be lifted entirely. Soviet propaganda broadcasts announced the destruction of enemy fortifications and the liberation of towns and villages, framing the operation as a decisive turning point in the war. By 19th January, Soviet forces had liberated Krasnoye Selo, a key strongpoint in the German defensive belt. The capture of this position threatened to cut off German units holding Ropsha and opened the road toward Gachina. Soviet reports indicate that over 20,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the first 5 days of fighting, while German records show significant losses in men and material, though exact figures remain uncertain due to chaotic withdrawals. The rapid Soviet gains forced Küchler to request permission for a tactical withdrawal to the Luga line, but Hitler rejected the proposal, insisting that every meter of ground be defended. The opening phase of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive thus established the operational pattern for the weeks to come: concentrated Soviet assaults, breakthroughs against overstretched German defenses, and continued German attempts to hold ground under inflexible orders from the top. The momentum was now with the Red Army, and the siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most destructive blockades in history, was on the verge of being broken completely. Following the initial breakthroughs south of Leningrad and around Novgorod in mid-January 1944, the Soviet High Command pressed forward with a series of coordinated offensives designed to exploit the German collapse and widen the breach. The overall goal was not merely the relief of Leningrad, which had already begun, but the complete destruction of the German 18th Army and the liberation of the surrounding regions that had been under occupation since 1941. This phase required meticulous planning, as the Soviet forces had to sustain offensive momentum while crossing difficult terrain in winter and while fighting entrenched enemy units that still possessed formidable defensive capacity. The strategic objectives of the Soviet command at this point were clear. Govorov's Leningrad front was to drive southwest through Krasnoye Selo toward Gachina and further toward Narva, threatening the Baltic states and severing the German land corridor along the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland. Meretskov Volkhov front, having retaken Novgorod, was ordered to continue its westward advance toward Luga, a major German logistical hub, thereby collapsing the central portion of the front. Simultaneously, Eremenko's Second Baltic Front would push toward Staraya Russa and Idritsa, aiming to stretch German defenses and prevent the transfer of reinforcements. This three-front strategy represented one of the largest coordinated operations attempted by the Red Army to date, involving over 20 armies and hundreds of thousands of men. Logistical preparation for such a large-scale operation in winter presented immense challenges. Supply routes had to be extended over frozen ground, often across hastily repaired rail lines and roads. The Red Army utilized sled columns, tracked vehicles, and horse-drawn carts to maintain a steady flow of ammunition, fuel, and food. Engineers were tasked with clearing paths through minefields and repairing bridges destroyed by retreating German units. Air supply was also integrated into planning, with Soviet aviation tasked not only with ground support, but with delivering critical supplies to forward positions. This logistical effort was crucial to sustaining the pace of the offensive, as delays could have allowed the Germans to regroup and re-establish strong defensive positions. For the Germans, the objectives were dictated not by operational logic, but by Hitler's directives. Field Marshal Küchler requested repeatedly to conduct a phased withdrawal to the prepared Luga line, which offered stronger natural defensive terrain along rivers and marshes. Hitler categorically refused, insisting that the front line south of Leningrad be held to prevent the Soviets from advancing into Estonia and threatening Army Group North's rear. As a result, the 18th Army, numbering around 350,000 men at the beginning of January, was forced to defend a collapsing line with divisions reduced to half or even one-third of their authorized strength. The 9th and 10th Luftwaffe Field Divisions, poorly trained and inadequately equipped, were especially vulnerable and suffered severe losses in the opening Soviet attacks. Propaganda played a role on both sides during this stage. Soviet broadcasts highlighted the liberation of Novgorod and Krasnoye Selo as historic victories, framing them as proof of the Red Army's unstoppable advance. German propaganda, meanwhile, portrayed the battle as another case of heroic defense against superior numbers, emphasizing the sacrifice of frontline soldiers while concealing the scale of losses. Reports intercepted by Soviet intelligence revealed declining morale among German troops, with letters describing hopeless defensive battles and fears of encirclement. Despite these differences, both sides faced similar practical difficulties. The terrain between Leningrad and Novgorod was characterized by forests, swamps, and frozen rivers, which limited maneuver and complicated the movement of tanks and artillery. Winter conditions, with temperatures often falling below -20°C, imposed further strain. Frostbite, equipment breakdowns, and supply shortages were widespread. Soviet commanders adapted by deploying ski battalions and light infantry to exploit the frozen terrain, while German units dug into fortified villages and forest strongpoints to slow the advance. A critical element in the Soviet plan was the coordination of artillery and air support. Red Army artillery had been massed at unprecedented levels, with densities reaching 150 to 200 guns per kilometer in breakthrough sectors. This overwhelming concentration allowed Soviet forces to systematically dismantle German defensive belts. Air support from the 13th and 15th Air Armies further reinforced Soviet firepower, with sorties targeting German supply columns, artillery batteries, and retreat routes. The Luftwaffe, once dominant over Leningrad, was now a diminished force. German air units in the sector could not match Soviet numbers, and fuel shortages further curtailed their ability to contest air superiority. By the third week of January, Soviet spearheads pushed deeper into the German rear. The fall of Novgorod severed key north-south communication lines, while Krasnoye Selo's liberation threatened to cut off German units holding Ropsha and MiGA. Soviet intelligence estimated that over 50,000 German troops risked encirclement if the Red Army could close the gap toward Luga. Stalin emphasized in his directives the need to exploit this opportunity fully, urging commanders to commit reserves to maintain offensive momentum. The German High Command recognized the danger but remained paralyzed by Hitler's insistence on holding ground. This led to piecemeal counterattacks, often involving understrength divisions such as the 12th Panzer Division, which was committed to battle with fewer than 60 operational tanks. These counterattacks achieved temporary local successes, but could not alter the overall situation. Soviet numerical superiority and coordinated planning ensured that every German tactical success was offset by larger Soviet advances elsewhere. Thus, the strategic and operational planning phase of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive highlighted the asymmetry of both sides' approaches. The Soviets prepared for a methodical offensive aimed at complete liberation of the region, supported by overwhelming material and manpower superiority. The Germans, constrained by political directives, attempted to defend untenable positions, leading to mounting losses and eventual retreat. The stage was now set for the next phase, the first major engagements that would determine whether the siege of Leningrad was truly broken or whether the Germans could stabilize their lines long enough to preserve their hold in the Baltic. The first major clashes of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive unfolded in a series of violent engagements that revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Soviet operation. After the artillery and infantry breakthroughs in mid-January 1944, Soviet formations pressed forward against German defensive belts that had been built and reinforced over 2 years of occupation. These fortifications were formidable: deep trench systems, concrete bunkers, and interlocking strongpoints situated in forests, marshes, and villages. Yet the weight of Soviet manpower and firepower steadily pried them open, producing sudden territorial shifts after months of static front lines. Southwest of Leningrad, the 42nd Army advanced toward Krasnoye Selo, a critical German position anchoring the southern arc of the siege. The attack combined infantry divisions with tank brigades that pushed through gaps created by massed artillery fire. By 19th January, Soviet troops entered Krasnoye Selo after days of close-quarter combat. The fighting inside the town involved block-to-block assaults, with flamethrower teams clearing bunkers and anti-tank units targeting German strongpoints. The fall of Krasnoye Selo represented not only a tactical gain, but also a symbolic one. It marked the collapse of one of the strongest German bastions threatening Leningrad. At the same time, the Second Shock Army advanced on Ropsha. German defenders, primarily elements of the 9th Luftwaffe Field Division, attempted to resist but lacked the cohesion and training to withstand sustained Soviet attacks. Reports indicate that several battalions simply disintegrated under artillery and infantry pressure, leaving gaps in the line that Soviet units exploited. By 20th January, Ropsha was in Soviet hands, and with it, the Germans' ability to shell Leningrad directly from that sector was eliminated. The capture of both Krasnoye Selo and Ropsha within a week created a dramatic shift. The siege of Leningrad, though not fully lifted until later, had been broken in military terms. Farther south, the Volkov front pressed toward Novgorod. German forces defending the city, including the 28th Jaeger Division and the 21st Infantry Division, mounted stubborn resistance. Novgorod had been fortified as a major German strongpoint, with defensive rings and artillery positions covering approaches across the Volkov River. The Soviet assault began with artillery barrages, followed by infantry and tank thrusts across the frozen river and surrounding marshes. The fighting was fierce, with German troops clinging to defensive positions inside the city's medieval walls. However, the overwhelming weight of Soviet forces proved decisive. On 20th January, Soviet troops stormed Novgorod, engaging in street fighting that destroyed much of the historic city. The Germans were forced to retreat westward, abandoning a site they had held since August 1941. These initial engagements carried immediate consequences for the civilian population. In liberated areas around Krasnoye Selo and Novgorod, Soviet forces encountered ruins, depopulated villages, and evidence of forced labor and deportations carried out by the Germans. Survivors reported harsh occupation conditions, widespread executions, and the destruction of cultural monuments. For Leningrad itself, the end of direct artillery bombardment reduced the daily civilian death toll, though hunger and disease continued to claim lives. The lifting of the siege was still more symbolic than material at this stage, but it marked the beginning of a profound change in morale for both civilians and soldiers. German responses to these defeats were fragmented. Field Marshal Küchler attempted to stabilize the front by committing reserves from the 12th Panzer Division and elements of the 61st Infantry Division, but these formations were under strength. Counterattacks recaptured some villages temporarily, but could not halt the overall Soviet advance. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal to the Luga line left German units exposed, forced to fight on unfavorable terms in terrain that offered little natural protection once the fortified towns were lost. This rigidity condemned the 18th Army to further attrition without realistic hope of stabilization. The psychological impact of the early Soviet victories was enormous. For Leningraders, who had endured nearly 900 days of siege, the news that Krasnoye Selo and Ropsha were liberated confirmed that the blockade was being broken. For the Red Army, it was proof that their growing mastery of offensive operations could overcome even the most entrenched German defenses. For the Germans, however, the fall of Novgorod and the collapse south of Leningrad signaled that Army Group North faced the prospect of encirclement and retreat, undermining morale across the entire front. By the end of January, the Soviet spearheads had advanced 60 to 100 kilometers in some sectors, shattering defensive belts that had held firm for more than 2 years. What had begun as localized breakthroughs rapidly evolved into a broader collapse of German positions. The clashes of this phase confirmed the irreversible shift in the balance of power. The Red Army was now capable of mounting coordinated, large-scale offensives that not only liberated territory, but threatened the strategic integrity of the entire German front in the northwest. By the final days of January 1944, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive entered a new and more complex phase. The Red Army, having broken through the German defensive belts and liberated Krasnoye Selo, Rapsha, and Novgorod, now pushed deeper into the occupied territory of northwestern Russia. The Soviet aim was to expand the offensive, drive the Germans back to the Luga River line, and ideally cut off and destroy major elements of the 18th Army before they could reorganize. This required sustained operations across frozen terrain, dense forests, and fortified towns, each presenting significant tactical and logistical challenges. The escalation of the fighting brought about heavy reinforcement commitments on both sides. The Soviets fed fresh units into the offensive, including formations of the 67th Army and additional Guards rifle divisions. Their offensive lines now stretched across more than 300 kilometers of front, involving hundreds of thousands of troops supported by thousands of artillery pieces. The Germans, under Field Marshal Küchler, attempted to plug gaps with mobile reserves such as the 12th Panzer Division and the 58th Infantry Division. These formations were rushed from sector to sector, conducting local counterattacks designed to delay Soviet progress. However, with divisions reduced in strength, often numbering fewer than 5,000 combat-effective men instead of their theoretical 15,000, such efforts achieved only temporary relief. Terrain and weather amplified the difficulties. The ground remained frozen, which in some cases aided tank and vehicle movement, but also forced both armies to rely on sleds, horses, and manual labor for supply transport. Snowstorms reduced visibility and slowed advances, while temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius inflicted frostbite casualties. The Soviets had prepared by equipping ski battalions and engineering units capable of moving rapidly across the snow-covered landscape, giving them an edge in mobility. German units, short of winter clothing and struggling with inadequate supply lines, saw their effective strength reduced not only by combat, but by illness and exposure. Civilians in the combat zone suffered acutely as the front shifted. Villages in the Luga sector became battlefields, with inhabitants forced to flee or face crossfire. Soviet reports describe burned-out settlements, deportations carried out by retreating German forces, and German occupation policies had already drained local resources over 2 years, leaving little food or livestock for surviving civilians. The rapid Soviet advance did not immediately alleviate these conditions, as the priority remained on sustaining combat operations, not humanitarian relief. One of the most intense engagements of this phase occurred around Gatchina, a town southwest of Leningrad that served as a logistical hub for German forces. Soviet units of the 42nd Army advanced against heavily fortified positions there in late January. German defenders used prepared strongpoints and anti-tank obstacles to slow the assault, while local counterattacks attempted to cut off Soviet spearheads. After several days of artillery duels and house-to-house combat, the Soviets secured Gatchina by the end of January. Its capture opened the road toward Luga and further threatened to envelop German forces still holding positions closer to Leningrad. In parallel, the Volkhov front pressed westward following the capture of Novgorod. Their next objective was Luga, a key German defensive anchor. The Germans committed significant resources to hold Luga, recognizing its strategic importance for maintaining a stable front line. Elements of the 121st Infantry Division and the 12th Panzer Division were deployed to reinforce the area, but continuous Soviet pressure strained their capacity. By early February, Soviet spearheads had reached the outskirts of Luga, cutting off some German units and forcing desperate counterattacks. The escalation also highlighted challenges in Soviet command and control. While overall coordination among the three Soviet fronts was improving, communication delays and logistical bottlenecks sometimes created gaps in the offensive. Some rifle divisions advanced too quickly without adequate flank protection, leading to temporary encirclements by German counterattacks. Others became bogged down against unexpectedly strong German defenses. Nevertheless, the Red Army's growing depth in manpower and reserves allowed commanders to absorb such setbacks and continue pressing forward. German attempts to stabilize the situation revealed the constraints of Hitler's defensive policy. Orders from Führer headquarters insisted on holding positions at all costs, prohibiting tactical withdrawals even when the situation was untenable. This rigidity led to the loss of entire regiments and battalions trapped by Soviet advances. German generals, including Küchler, argued for a withdrawal to the Panther Line, a heavily fortified position along the Narva and Velikaya rivers, prepared as a fallback, but Hitler repeatedly rejected such proposals, declaring that surrendering ground in the north would be politically and militarily unacceptable. The consequences were severe. By February 1944, divisions that had once been considered elite, such as the 12th Panzer and the 61st Infantry, were reduced to skeletal strength. The Luftwaffe could provide little relief, with fewer than 200 operational aircraft available in the entire Army Group North sector, compared to over 1,000 Soviet planes. Soviet air superiority allowed for near-constant harassment of German supply lines, further undermining defensive capacity. Internationally, news of the Soviet successes resonated strongly. In London and Washington, reports of the lifting of the siege of Leningrad were hailed as evidence of Soviet resilience and growing power. The Western Allies saw in these offensives confirmation that Germany was losing its grip on the Eastern Front. In Berlin, however, propaganda attempted to downplay the Soviet advances, portraying them as temporary setbacks. Nonetheless, German civilian morale began to erode as, by the end of the escalation phase, the Red Army had achieved several key goals. It had liberated large swaths of territory south and southwest of Leningrad, broken major German fortifications, and inflicted severe losses on the 18th Army. Yet the battle was far from over. The Germans, though battered, still held the Luga Line and significant positions in the Baltic approaches. The next phase of the campaign would involve the largest and most intense fighting yet, as the Soviets sought to deliver a decisive blow, and the Germans fought desperately to preserve Army Group North from collapse. By early February 1944, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive reached its most intense stage. The Red Army committed its full weight against the German 18th Army in an effort to break through to the Luga Line and destroy the enemy's capacity to continue defending the approaches to Estonia and the Baltic. This period became the peak of the campaign, marked by large-scale battles, heavy casualties, and the final collapse of the German positions that had threatened Leningrad for more than 2 years. The Soviet command massed overwhelming strength. The Leningrad front fielded the 42nd Army, 67th Army, and 2nd Shock Army, supported by powerful artillery groupings and tank brigades. The Volkov front pressed on with the 59th and 8th Armies, while the 2nd Baltic front tied down German units to the south. Altogether, more than 1.25 million Soviet soldiers participated in the offensive, with approximately 20,000 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, and around 1,300 combat aircraft. Against this, Army Group North mustered around 740,000 men, with the bulk concentrated in the 18th Army, supported by fewer than 400 operational tanks and assault guns, and situated on the Luga River, the town served as a transportation hub linking German forces along the front. Its defense was entrusted to elements of the 12th Panzer Division, the 121st Infantry Division, and remnants of other battered formations. The Germans had fortified the river line with trenches, bunkers, and artillery, hoping to delay the Soviet advance. Beginning in the first week of February, Soviet artillery opened a sustained bombardment, followed by frontal infantry assaults and wide flanking maneuvers through frozen marshland. The fighting around Luga lasted more than 2 weeks. Soviet reports described the destruction of dozens of bunkers and the crossing of the Luga River under withering fire. German counterattacks with the remaining tanks of the 12th Panzer achieved temporary local successes, but were gradually overwhelmed. By 12th February, Luga fell, and with it the backbone of the German defense in the sector. Further north, the capture of Gachina opened the road to Narva and pushed German forces back toward Estonia. Here, Soviet spearheads advanced 60 to 100 kilometers in less than a month, forcing the Germans to retreat from positions they had occupied since 1941. In the Novgorod sector, Soviet troops continued to clear villages and forests, cutting off retreating German units and capturing thousands of prisoners. The destruction of the German garrison at Novgorod, combined with the loss of Luga, effectively severed Army Group North's forward positions and forced a general retreat. Civilian suffering during this stage was immense. As the Soviets advanced, they uncovered the devastation left behind by years of occupation. Entire villages had been burned during German retreats, crops destroyed, and populations deported. In Novgorod, Soviet investigators documented the system. Survivors described forced labor, executions, and widespread famine. In Leningrad itself, the lifting of the siege in January had ended the worst of the starvation, but the city remained in ruins, with over 1 million civilian dead since 1941. The offensive thus had immediate humanitarian consequences. It liberated territory, but revealed the immense scale of destruction inflicted during the siege and occupation. For the Germans, the peak of the campaign marked a turning point from defensive operations to outright survival. Hitler's refusal to authorize an orderly withdrawal to the Panther Line left divisions trapped and destroyed. The 18th Army lost more than 70,000 men in January and February alone through death, wounds, or capture. Equipment losses were equally severe. Hundreds of artillery pieces and vehicles abandoned during retreats, and divisions reduced to Kampfgruppen of a few hundred. Field Marshal Küchler, commander of Army Group North, repeatedly requested permission to fall back, but when his appeals failed, he was dismissed in late January and replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. Even under new command, the situation remained dire. The Soviet side also endured heavy casualties. Precise numbers are difficult to establish, but estimates suggest that the Red Army lost over 100,000 men in the course of the offensive, many of them in frontal assaults against fortified river lines and strong points. Tank brigades were heavily attrited, with some formations reduced to fewer than 10 operational vehicles by mid-February. Nevertheless, Soviet superiority in reserves and logistics allowed the offensive to continue, unlike the Germans, who lacked replacements. By the end of February, the peak battles had achieved their strategic goal. The Germans were forced to abandon their long-standing positions south of Leningrad and Novgorod and retreat toward Estonia and the Panther Line. The siege of Leningrad was conclusively broken, and the Red Army had gained momentum that it would carry into the Baltic campaigns of 1944. The cost had been immense for both sides, but the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The Red Army demonstrated that it could not only lift the siege of one of its greatest cities, but also drive the Wehrmacht into a retreat that would not end until the war's conclusion. With the fall of Luga and the collapse of German forward positions, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive entered a stage defined by adaptation and resistance. Both sides, though exhausted, sought ways to continue the fight under radically altered circumstances. For the Soviets, the challenge lay in maintaining the momentum of an offensive that had already liberated vast areas, but at heavy cost. For the Germans, survival demanded improvised tactics, reorganization of shattered units, and desperate measures to delay a full Soviet breakthrough into the Baltic region. Soviet armies pressed onward despite attrition. The 42nd and 67th Armies of the Leningrad front, which had spearheaded the assault toward Gatchina and Luga, were reinforced with fresh rifle divisions and artillery regiments. The Volkhov front, meanwhile, pushed west from Novgorod, aiming to complete the destruction of German units retreating from the Volkhov River line. The Second Baltic Front increased its pressure in the Staraya. Ammunition stocks were depleted after weeks of heavy artillery fire, fuel supplies lagged behind fast-moving spearheads, and forward units sometimes advanced faster than their supporting elements, creating temporary vulnerabilities. To cope with these challenges, Soviet commanders adapted their methods. Instead of continuous large-scale frontal assaults, they increasingly relied on concentrated strikes by smaller, better-supported groups. Engineers played a central role, clearing frozen rivers of mines, building pontoon bridges, and opening new supply routes across difficult terrain. Ski battalions and light infantry units proved especially effective in pursuing retreating German forces through forests and across snowfields. Partisan detachments also intensified operations behind German lines, sabotaging railway lines and ambushing supply columns, further undermining the ability of the Wehrmacht to regroup. German divisions that had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength were reorganized into Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups composed of whatever infantry, artillery, and vehicles remained operational. These Kampfgruppen often fought tenaciously from fortified villages or forest clearings, delaying Soviet advances for days at a time. Mobile reserves, including remnants of the 12th Panzer Division, conducted counterattacks that, while small in scale, inflicted losses and forced the Soviets to commit additional resources. However, such resistance could not alter the overall balance of power, as the Red Army's numerical superiority and depth of reserves gradually wore down each German attempt to stabilize the front. The psychological toll of this stage was evident on both sides. For Soviet soldiers, the liberation of Leningrad and Novgorod provided a powerful morale boost, yet the relentless pace of operations combined with severe winter conditions created fatigue and frustration. Many units had suffered catastrophic losses in manpower and equipment, and replacements often arrived with minimal training. German soldiers, meanwhile, faced collapsing defenses and the knowledge that retreat had become inevitable. Letters and diaries later recovered from the front revealed despair and a sense of abandonment by higher command. Hitler's insistence on holding ground had already led to the destruction of several divisions, and survivors feared the same fate awaited them further west. Civilian populations caught in the shifting front lines endured further hardship. German forces retreating through villages frequently employed scorched earth tactics, destroying houses, crops, and infrastructure to deny resources to the advancing Red Army. Soviet troops often found liberated areas reduced to rubble, with residents homeless and starving in the depths of winter. Partisan reports described entire districts burned during German withdrawals. Relief efforts by Soviet authorities were limited during active operations, as all resources were concentrated on sustaining the offensive, leaving civilians to struggle until rear area administrations could be re-established. By mid-February, the Germans attempted to consolidate their retreat along the so-called Panther Line, a fortified defensive system running through Narva, Pskov, and Ostrov. Though incomplete and underprepared, this line was intended to provide Army Group North with a stable position from which to defend the Baltic states. The retreat toward this line was chaotic. Soviet advances cut rail links, forcing German units to abandon heavy equipment. Prisoner reports indicate that entire battalions marched for days without food or adequate clothing, further reducing combat effectiveness. For the Soviets, the prospect of breaking into the offensive had already achieved its immediate objective, the complete lifting of the siege of Leningrad, but Stalin now demanded more: the destruction of Army Group North and the liberation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This required continued adaptation. Supply lines had to be rebuilt across newly liberated areas, bridging destroyed infrastructure. The Red Army also had to confront the reality of German forces still capable of fighting hard defensive battles despite their losses. Thus, The stage of resistance and adaptation highlighted the evolving nature of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. The Soviets refined their offensive methods to maintain momentum, while the Germans improvised to delay inevitable defeat. Both armies suffered from exhaustion and attrition, and civilians bore the brunt of scorched earth tactics and the devastation left by years of occupation. As February drew to a close, the Red Army stood on the threshold of the Baltic frontier, while the Germans clung desperately to the Panther Line, hoping to transform retreat into defense and prevent total collapse. By late February 1944, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive approached a decisive turning point. The Soviet advances had already shattered the German 18th Army's fortified positions around Luga and Novgorod, but the ultimate question remained whether the Red Army could force a full collapse of Army Group North, or whether the Germans could stabilize their retreat on the Panther Line. This phase was defined by a series of critical battles and command decisions that determined the momentum of the campaign. The Soviet plan for the next stage of operations was ambitious. Govorov's Leningrad front pushed westward toward Narva, aiming to cross into Estonia and secure a foot. Meretskov's Volkhov front continued driving on Staraya Russa and toward Pskov, while Eremenko's Second Baltic Front increased pressure against German forces south of Lake Ilmen. The coordination of these thrusts aimed to envelop and destroy large parts of the 18th Army before it could reorganize. In total, Soviet forces committed to this stage numbered over 1 million men, supported by several thousand tanks, assault guns, and a dense concentration of artillery. German resistance during this critical period was directed by the new commander of Army Group North, Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced Küchler in late January. Known for his skill in defensive warfare, Model sought to buy time for the construction and manning of the Panther Line. His approach emphasized delaying actions, flexible withdrawals, and the use of mobile reserves to conduct counterattacks against Soviet spearheads. Yet he faced severe limitations. Many divisions were reduced to Kampfgruppen of a few thousand men. Artillery and tank strength had been heavily depleted, and supply lines were under constant Soviet air attack. One of the key turning point battles occurred along the Narva River. Soviet forces advancing through Gachina and toward the Gulf of Finland aimed to seize Narva, a vital gateway into Estonia. The Germans rushed reinforcements, including the 170th Infantry Division and elements of SS volunteer units, to establish a defensive bridgehead on the western bank of the river. Fighting around Narva in late February and early March was intense, with Soviet assaults repeatedly attempting to cross the frozen river under heavy artillery and machine gun fire. Despite suffering heavy losses, the Germans managed to hold Narva for the moment, preventing a rapid Soviet breakthrough into Estonia. This stand marked a temporary success for Model's strategy, buying time at the cost of further attrition. Further south, the Soviets pushed toward Pskov, a city of strategic and symbolic importance. The German 16th Army, already battered, attempted to defend positions east of the city, but faced relentless pressure from the Volkhov and Second Baltic fronts. Soviet forces advanced across frozen terrain, bypassing strongpoints when possible and cutting supply routes. By early March, German units in the Pskov sector were forced to abandon forward defenses and withdraw closer to the Panther Line, leaving behind destroyed bridges, burned villages, and thousands of dead. The turning point of this phase was not defined by a single battle, but by the cumulative realization that the Germans could no longer hold their former positions in northern Russia. The siege of Leningrad was conclusively broken. Novgorod and Luga were in. The once stable blockade that had held Leningrad under siege since 1941 had been dismantled in less than 2 months of continuous fighting. For civilians, the repercussions of this turning point were profound. In Leningrad, artillery bombardments ceased, and rail links to the rest of the Soviet Union were restored. The population, reduced from 2.5 million in 1941 to barely over 600,000 by early 1944 due to death and evacuation, finally saw relief supplies flowing consistently into the city. In liberated towns such as Novgorod, however, Soviet authorities documented catastrophic destruction. Cultural monuments, medieval architecture, and entire neighborhoods had been deliberately razed by retreating German forces. Investigations by Soviet commissions recorded evidence of mass executions and forced deportations. The human cost for both armies was immense. By March 1944, Soviet casualties in the offensive exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded, while German losses were estimated at more than 70,000 men, including large numbers captured during retreats. The intensity of fighting, combined with winter conditions, strained both sides. Yet the balance of losses favored the Soviets, who had the reserves to sustain operations, while the Germans faced permanent depletion of their divisions. Thus, the turning point of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive was characterized by two realities. The Red Army had achieved its primary strategic objective by lifting the siege and forcing a German retreat, and the Germans, despite temporary successes at Narva and elsewhere, had entered a defensive posture from which recovery was no longer possible. The fate of Army Group North was sealed not by a single decisive blow, but by the relentless accumulation of Soviet victories and the inability of German forces to adapt quickly enough to prevent retreat into the Baltic states. The campaign had reached a decisive threshold, and its consequences would soon ripple across the wider Eastern Front. By March 1944, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive reached its closing phase. Combat operations that had begun with concentrated artillery barrages and breakthrough assaults gradually shifted into pursuits, withdrawals, and the consolidation of newly liberated territory. For the Red Army, the focus was now on exploiting success and stabilizing. Units that had once maintained fortified lines now withdrew through forests and marshes, burning villages and destroying bridges behind them. German commanders attempted to impose order on the withdrawal, but reports from both Soviet and German sources describe widespread chaos. Columns of infantry and horse-drawn carts stretched for kilometers along frozen roads, frequently attacked by Soviet aircraft and partisan groups. Heavy weapons and vehicles were often abandoned when fuel supplies ran out, or when retreat routes became impassable. Entire battalions dissolved during the withdrawal, their survivors absorbed into ad hoc Kampfgruppen. Soviet forces pressed the pursuit vigorously, but the offensive pace inevitably slowed as supply difficulties mounted. The rapid advance had outstripped rail lines, forcing reliance on truck convoys and horse-drawn transport over poor winter roads. Artillery units required time to reposition, and tank brigades suffered from mechanical breakdowns after weeks of continuous movement. Commanders prioritized securing key transportation hubs, particularly Pskov and Ostrov, as staging grounds for future operations. In many sectors, Soviet units paused to regroup, rather than risk overextension into areas where German rearguards could inflict disproportionate losses. The liberation of occupied territories produced immediate consequences for civilians. In towns such as Novgorod, Gatchina, and Luga, Soviet investigators found evidence of systematic destruction. Cultural monuments were reduced to rubble, industries dismantled or destroyed, and populations decimated by deportation, famine, and executions. Humanitarian crises unfolded in liberated areas, with food shortages and shelter remaining acute until Soviet authorities could restore administrative structures and supply systems. For the German side, the consequences of withdrawal were equally severe. Army Group North lost tens of thousands of men in casualties during the retreat, with many more captured. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of artillery pieces, tanks, and trucks were destroyed or abandoned. The defensive line finally stabilized only after German forces fell back to the Panther Line, stretching from Narva in the north through Pskov to Ostrov and further south. Even then, the line was incomplete, and its defenses were hastily prepared under constant Soviet pressure. The political impact of the Soviet success was significant. On 27 January 1944, Soviet authorities declared the siege of Leningrad. Celebrations in the city included artillery salutes and public ceremonies, marking the end of nearly 900 days of blockade. Internationally, the victory was broadcast as a symbol of Soviet resilience and growing military power. Allied governments in London and Washington praised the lifting of the siege, recognizing it as one of the war's major turning points. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry struggled to explain the retreat, framing it as a tactical maneuver to shorter lines. But the loss of Novgorod, Luga, and the end of the blockade could not be concealed. Casualty figures from the entire offensive reflected the scale of the fighting. Soviet records indicate more than 260,000 casualties, including over 70,000 killed. German losses are estimated at over 70,000, though precise numbers remain contested. The disparity, however, was offset by the fact that Soviet reserves could replenish depleted divisions, while German manpower shortages meant that lost divisions could rarely be rebuilt. By the time combat operations subsided in March 1944, the strategic situation in the Northwest had been transformed. The siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and deadliest in history, was permanently broken. Soviet forces had advanced up to 300 kilometers in some sectors, liberating vast areas and pushing the Germans onto the defensive in the Baltic states. For Army Group North, the retreat marked the beginning of a defensive struggle that would continue until its eventual destruction in the Courland Pocket in 1945. The immediate aftermath of the offensive revealed both the scale of Soviet achievement and the immense cost. Leningrad, though no longer under siege, its industries required years to recover, its population had been reduced by more than half, and its survivors carried the trauma of starvation and bombardment. For the Germans, the retreat signaled the irreversible erosion of their ability to hold occupied Soviet territory. The once formidable Army Group North was now weakened, forced into a reactive role, and increasingly reliant on hastily fortified defensive lines. Thus, the withdrawal phase of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive concluded the combat operations of early 1944. The Red Army had broken the siege, liberated key regions, and set the stage for further offensives into the Baltic. The Wehrmacht had lost its grip on northern Russia and entered a period of retreat from which it would never recover. The consequences for civilians, soldiers, and the broader war effort underscored the offensive's importance, even if it remained overshadowed by larger campaigns. The long-term significance of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive extended far beyond the immediate lifting of the siege. Militarily, politically, and culturally, the operation reshaped the balance of power on the Eastern Front and left a profound imprint on both Soviet and German histories. It was the culmination of over 2 years of attritional struggle, and while costly in human lives, it marked a decisive shift towards Soviet dominance in the North. Militarily, the offensive ended the blockade of Leningrad once and for all. The German 18th Army was forced back up to 300 kilometers in some sectors, losing heavily in manpower and equipment. Its divisions, already depleted, were now incapable of rebuilding to full strength. The attempt to stabilize on the Panther Line provided only temporary relief. By removing the threat to Leningrad, the Red Army secured its northern flank, freed industrial resources for renewed production, and gained the ability to project force into the Baltic states. The survival of Leningrad's industry and ports also carried strategic weight, as they could once again support naval operations in the Baltic and supply lines for northern operations. Politically, the victory was used by the Soviet leadership as proof of resilience and strength. The official announcement on 27 January 1944 declared the city fully liberated, marking the end of 872 days of siege. Stalin and the Soviet High Command presented the success as a symbol of national endurance and a demonstration to the Allies of the Soviet Union's growing power. In Allied capitals, the lifting of the siege was widely reported as one of the most dramatic turning points of the war, reinforcing the perception that Germany's defeat was inevitable. For Hitler, however, the loss represented both a strategic failure and a personal humiliation, as his refusal to authorize timely withdrawals had directly contributed to the destruction of Army Group North's positions. The cultural and human consequences were immense. The siege of Leningrad had cost the lives of more than 1 million civilians, most through starvation, disease, and bombardment. Although the blockade was broken in military terms, the city emerged devastated, large sections of its infrastructure destroyed, its population reduced by more than half, and its survivors permanently scarred. Yet the endurance of Leningraders during the siege became one of the central narratives of Soviet wartime memory. The 1944 victory was presented not only as a military achievement, but as the ultimate vindication of the sacrifices made by the city's defenders and civilians. From the German perspective, the offensive highlighted the limitation. By refusing timely withdrawals, he condemned divisions to destruction and accelerated the weakening of Army Group North. Although temporary defensive successes were achieved at Narva and later along the Panther Line, the broader trend was irreversible. The Wehrmacht no longer had the reserves to sustain its positions in northern Russia. Within months, Soviet forces would continue their advance into Estonia and Latvia, driving Army Group North toward eventual isolation in the Courland Pocket, where it remained trapped until May 1945. In the broader scope of the war, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive contributed to the strategic sequence that culminated in Operation Bagration in June 1944. By tying down and weakening Army Group North, the offensive prevented German reinforcements from being shifted south to Belarus. The attrition inflicted in the north thus directly facilitated the destruction of Army Group Center later that summer. In this way, the battle's significance extended beyond the regional level, shaping the overall trajectory of the Eastern Front. Commemoration of the offensive has been shaped by its dual legacy of immense suffering and decisive victory. In the Soviet Union, the lifting of the siege was celebrated annually, with Leningrad awarded the title of Hero City in 1945. Memorials and monuments emphasized the endurance of civilians, the heroism of soldiers, and the cultural survival of the city. In Germany, post-war accounts often focused on the defensive skill of individual units and the difficulties imposed by Hitler's orders, but the broader narrative recognized the offensive as a turning point that ended any hope of holding northern Russia. In historical debate, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive has sometimes been overshadowed. It demonstrated the Red Army's growing ability to coordinate large-scale offensives across multiple fronts, integrating artillery, armor, infantry, and air power in sustained operations. It highlighted the declining resilience of the German army in the face of superior Soviet numbers and planning. Most of all, it ended one of the longest and most destructive sieges in modern history, liberating a city whose survival had become a matter of global attention. Thus, the legacy of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive is both regional and global. It secured the Soviet Northwest, paved the way for the liberation of the Baltic states, and symbolized the irreversible shift in the war's momentum. For the survivors of Leningrad, it marked the end of starvation and bombardment. For the Wehrmacht, it was a signal that their era of offensives was long past, and that even their strongest positions could no longer be held. In the broader arc of history, it remains one of the defining moments of the Eastern Front, embodying both the unimaginable cost of total war and the capacity of nations to endure and overcome.